The day my boss fired me, he told me I'd never make it in this industry. 6 months later, he was calling me 3 times a day begging for my help. But before I tell you about that call, you need to understand who Rick was. Because if I start with the firing, you'll probably think I was exaggerating. Trust me. I wish I was. When I first joined North Ridge Development, everyone warned me about Rick. Not directly. Nobody ever sat me down and said, "Watch out for that guy." It was more subtle than that. The kind of warning people give when they're afraid someone might overhear. A raised eyebrow. An awkward laugh. A look exchanged across a conference table. At first I didn't understand it. Honestly, my first impression of Rick was pretty good. He was confident. Organized. Always seemed to know exactly what was happening on every project. The owner trusted him. Clients respected him. And whenever Rick walked into a room, people immediately paid attention. Back then I thought that was leadership. I was wrong. What I didn't realize was that everyone paid attention because they were afraid of becoming his next target. The office itself was small. About 20 employees. Most of us had worked together long enough that we knew each other's families, birthdays, and weekend plans. It felt less like a company and more like a strange little community. Which made Rick stand out even more. Because while everyone else built relationships, Rick built leverage. He remembered mistakes. Every mistake. A typo in an email. A missed phone call. A late report. Things normal people would forget after a day or two. Rick remembered them forever. And somehow, months later, he'd bring them back up when it benefited him. The first time I saw it happen was during my second month on the job. And looking back, I should have realized then exactly what kind of person I was working for. The first time Rick really got my attention involved a guy named Kevin. Kevin worked in estimating. Good guy. Quiet. One of those people who always seemed stressed but still found time to help everyone else. At the time, Kevin had been with the company almost 4 years. Long enough that he knew the systems better than most people. One Friday afternoon, Kevin made a mistake on a proposal. Nothing catastrophic. A client received an outdated version of a document. The error was caught within an hour. The client didn't even care. Honestly, it should have been a 5-minute conversation. Instead, Rick turned it into a public event. The following Monday, he called a department meeting. Everyone showed up expecting updates on active projects. Instead, Rick spent 20 minutes discussing Kevin's mistake. Not the process. Not how to prevent it from happening again. Kevin. Specifically Kevin. Every sentence felt personal. Every example pointed back to him. I remember looking around the room and seeing people avoid eye contact. Nobody wanted to be there. Nobody wanted to watch it. But nobody stopped it either. Eventually Kevin apologized. Then apologized again. Then apologized a third time. Rick just kept going. When the meeting finally ended, Kevin looked exhausted. Like someone had spent an hour slowly letting the air out of him. A few weeks later, something interesting happened. Rick made a mistake. A big one. One that actually cost the company money. Do you know what happened? Nothing. No meeting. No apology. No discussion. The mistake simply disappeared. That was the first time I started noticing a pattern. When employees made mistakes, Rick treated them like character flaws. When Rick made mistakes, they somehow became learning experiences. And once I noticed it, I couldn't stop seeing it. The second time I saw Rick destroy someone was a lot harder to ignore. Her name was Sarah. She managed client communication. If a customer called, emailed, complained, or had a question, Sarah was usually the person who dealt with it. She was good at her job. Everybody knew it. Clients loved her. which, looking back, may have been part of the problem. One morning a client sent an angry email about a scheduling issue. The problem wasn't Sarah's fault. The scheduling team had given her incorrect information. Everyone involved knew that. Including Rick. But during the weekly meeting, Rick printed the email and passed copies around the room. Then he asked Sarah to explain herself. I remember watching her face as she read it. She looked confused. Then embarrassed. Then angry. Because she knew exactly what was happening. Rick wasn't trying to solve a problem. He was putting on a show. For 15 minutes he questioned every decision she'd made. Every response she'd sent. Every conversation she'd had. By the end of the meeting, you'd think Sarah had nearly destroyed the company. The reality? The client renewed their contract the following month. Nothing had happened. The entire thing had been theater. That was when I started noticing something. Rick didn't actually care about mistakes. He cared about control. And the easiest way to control people was to make them afraid. Once I noticed the pattern, I couldn't stop seeing it. The office practically ran on fear. People double-checked emails they already knew were correct. People stayed late just to avoid criticism. People apologized for things that weren't their fault. And every decision somehow came back to Rick. The weird thing is that he was good at hiding it from people outside the company. Clients loved him. The owner trusted him. New employees usually liked him. For the first few months, at least. Then reality slowly set in. One of the newest hires was a guy named Tyler. Fresh out of college. Smart. Confident. The kind of person who still believed hard work solved everything. He reminded me a lot of myself. One afternoon Tyler made the mistake of correcting Rick during a project review. Not aggressively. Not disrespectfully. He simply pointed out that one of the numbers Rick was presenting was outdated. The room went silent. Rick smiled. Not an angry smile. A calm one. Which was somehow worse. Tyler apologized immediately. Rick told him not to worry about it. Then moved on. At the time I thought that was the end of it. It wasn't. Over the next few months, Tyler somehow ended up with every impossible assignment in the office. The worst deadlines. The worst clients. The worst projects. And somehow everyone knew why without ever saying it out loud. Rick never forgot being challenged. Ever. The crazy part is that I still believed I was different. I honestly thought if I worked hard enough, stayed professional enough, and kept my head down, I'd avoid becoming a target. That's probably why Rick liked me at first. I never challenged him. I never argued. I did what I was told. If a project needed extra hours, I stayed. If someone needed help, I volunteered. If a deadline looked impossible, I figured out a way to make it work. For almost 3 years, that strategy seemed successful. Rick trusted me with bigger projects. More responsibility. More client communication. I thought I was finally earning respect. What I didn't realize was that I was becoming useful. And to Rick, useful wasn't the same thing as valuable. Useful people get used. Valuable people get protected. I was about to learn the difference. The beginning of the end started with a project called Cedar Ridge. At the time, it was the biggest project our company had landed all year. Big client. Big budget. Big expectations. Everyone was talking about it. And Rick made it very clear that failure wasn't an option. What none of us knew was that Cedar Ridge was about to become the excuse Rick had been waiting for. At first, Cedar Ridge looked like the opportunity of a lifetime. The client was one of the biggest we'd ever worked with. The budget was huge. The timeline was aggressive. And the company treated it like a make-or-break project. Rick was obsessed with it. Every meeting eventually turned into a Cedar Ridge meeting. Every conversation somehow led back to Cedar Ridge. Every department was being pushed harder than usual. At first, I didn't mind. Honestly, I was excited. For the first time in my career, I felt like I was trusted with something important. Rick gave me more responsibility than ever before. More client communication. More scheduling authority. More visibility. It felt like everything I'd worked for was finally paying off. Then the deadline started changing. Every week the client wanted something sooner. Every week Rick promised it could be done. The problem was that Rick wasn't the one doing the work. We were. And every time he made a promise, the pressure landed on everyone else. Still, nobody pushed back. Because pushing back on Rick never ended well. Instead, everyone just worked harder. Longer hours. More weekends. Less sleep. The entire office felt like it was running on caffeine and stress. And somehow, Rick seemed happier than ever. Looking back, I think that's because chaos was where he felt most comfortable. The more pressure there was, the easier it became to control people. And Cedar Ridge was about to create more pressure than any project we'd ever handled. About 2 months into the project, the first real problems appeared. Nothing catastrophic. Just little things. Material delays. Vendor issues. Scheduling conflicts. The kind of problems that happen on almost every large project. Normally, they'd be manageable. But Cedar Ridge wasn't being managed normally. Every time someone reported a problem, Rick demanded a solution immediately. Not tomorrow. Not next week. Immediately. It didn't matter if the solution was realistic. What mattered was making the problem disappear. At least temporarily. One afternoon, I sat in a meeting watching 3 department heads explain why a shipment couldn't arrive on time. The supplier simply didn't have the inventory available. It was impossible. Rick listened quietly. Then he asked a question. Have you tried harder? I remember thinking he was joking. He wasn't. For 20 minutes, he argued with people about a problem nobody could control. Eventually everyone just stopped responding. The meeting ended with no solution. But somehow everyone still left feeling like they'd failed. That was Rick's real talent. Making impossible situations feel like personal shortcomings. And the closer Cedar Ridge got to completion, the worse it became. People started quitting. Not all at once. Just one here. One there. Enough that everyone noticed. Nobody said it out loud. But we all knew why. The project wasn't breaking people. Rick was. The warning signs were everywhere. The problem was that I ignored them. Partly because I was busy. Partly because I wanted Cedar Ridge to succeed. And partly because I still believed Rick respected me. After all, he trusted me with more responsibility than anyone else. Or at least that's what I thought. Then one Friday afternoon, I received an email that changed everything. It looked routine. Just another approval request. One of hundreds I'd handled during the project. The document contained updates to a large material order. Nothing unusual. I reviewed everything carefully. Double-checked the numbers. Verified the quantities. Then forwarded it to Rick for final approval. A few minutes later he approved it. I still remember that email. Because later, I would read it at least 50 times. Trying to understand how everything went so wrong. At the time, though, I didn't think anything of it. I logged off. Went home. And enjoyed one of the few relaxing weekends I'd had in months. When Monday arrived, everything seemed normal. The office was busy. People were stressed. Cedar Ridge was still consuming everyone's life. Then around 9:30, Rick called an emergency meeting. And the moment I walked into that conference room, I knew something was wrong. Everyone was already seated. Nobody was talking. And Rick looked excited. Not angry. Excited. Which, in my experience, was always worse. Because whenever Rick looked excited, it usually meant someone else's life was about to get much harder. I just didn't realize that this time, that someone was me. Rick stood at the front of the room holding a stack of papers. Nobody spoke. Nobody even looked at each other. The atmosphere felt different. Heavy. Like everyone already knew somebody was about to have a very bad day. Rick waited until the room was completely silent. Then he started talking about Cedar Ridge. At first it sounded like a normal project update. Schedule changes. Vendor issues. Budget concerns. The usual stuff. Then he held up a report. And said someone had made a serious mistake. I remember feeling relieved. Not because I wanted someone else to be blamed. But because I knew the material order wasn't wrong. I'd checked it. Twice. Rick started explaining how the mistake could delay the project. How it could damage the client relationship. How it could cost the company money. Then he said my name. The moment he did, my stomach dropped. I still remember the feeling. Like missing a step on a staircase. I immediately knew where this was going. Rick projected the order onto the conference room screen. Then he pointed directly at it. According to him, the quantities were wrong. The shipment was wrong. The responsibility was mine. The crazy thing was that I knew none of that was true. Because I remembered sending the order. And more importantly, I remembered getting approval before it was submitted. Rick's approval. I tried explaining that. The second I opened my mouth, he cut me off. Not once. Every single time. It didn't matter what I said. He wasn't interested in answers. He was building a story. And everyone in that room knew it. The only question was whether anyone was willing to stop him. Nobody said a word. Not because they believed Rick. Because they were afraid. I'd seen this happen to other people. Now it was happening to me. Rick spent the next 10 minutes walking through every detail of the order. Every email. Every document. Every decision. And somehow, every road led back to me. The entire thing felt rehearsed. Like he'd prepared it in advance. The more he talked, the more confused I became. Because the numbers on the screen weren't the numbers I remembered approving. Something had changed. I just didn't know what. Then I remembered the email. The approval email. The one Rick personally signed off on. I still had it. The moment I mentioned it, the room got quiet. For the first time all morning, Rick hesitated. Only for a second. But I noticed. Then he smiled. The same smile I'd seen him use on Kevin. On Sarah. On Tyler. The smile that always meant trouble. Rick told the room that people often misremember things when they're under pressure. Then he continued talking as if I hadn't said anything at all. That was when I realized something. The meeting wasn't about finding the truth. The decision had already been made. This wasn't an investigation. It was an execution. When the meeting finally ended, nobody moved. Not immediately. People slowly gathered their things. Avoided eye contact. And quietly left the room. I remember standing there staring at the projector screen while everyone filed out around me. The whole thing felt unreal. Part of me still believed there had to be some misunderstanding. That once I showed Rick the approval email, everything would be fixed. It sounds stupid now. But at the time I genuinely thought facts mattered. Then Kevin walked past me. The same Kevin Rick had humiliated months earlier. He stopped for a second. Looked at me. And quietly said, "I'm sorry." Then he left. That was the moment I knew. Not because of what he said. Because of how he said it. Kevin didn't look confused. He looked defeated. Like he'd seen this exact thing happen before. And suddenly I realized something. Nobody in the office was surprised. Not a single person. They all knew exactly what was happening. Because Rick had done it before. Just not to me. Until now. The strange thing is that I wasn't even angry yet. Mostly I was confused. I kept replaying the approval email in my head. Trying to figure out what I'd missed. Trying to understand why Rick was doing this. At the time, I still thought the mistake was the story. I hadn't realized yet that the mistake didn't matter. The mistake was just the excuse. About an hour later, I got a calendar invitation. Meeting with Rick. Meeting with HR. Private conference room. 2 o'clock. The second I saw it, my stomach dropped. Everyone knows what those meetings mean. I spent the next few hours pretending to work. Answering emails. Updating spreadsheets. Moving my mouse around. But I wasn't really doing anything. I was waiting. And the waiting was worse than the meeting. Every possible outcome ran through my head. Maybe I was getting written up. Maybe I was being suspended. Maybe they were going to transfer me. Anything felt possible. Then 2 o'clock arrived. I walked into the conference room. The HR representative was already there. Rick was sitting at the table. Smiling. The same smile. The one I'd come to hate. And before anybody said a single word, I knew exactly how this meeting was going to end. Rick didn't waste any time. The moment I sat down, he slid a folder across the table. I didn't even open it. I already knew what was inside. The HR representative started reading from a prepared statement. Words like performance. Accountability. Professional standards. The kind of language companies use when they've already made a decision. I remember barely hearing any of it. I was too focused on Rick. Because he looked happy. Not relieved. Not disappointed. Happy. Like he'd been waiting for this. When the HR representative finished, I asked one question. Just one. I asked if anyone had reviewed the approval email. The one showing Rick had signed off on the order. The room went quiet. For the first time all day, Rick looked annoyed. Not angry. Annoyed. Like I'd interrupted something. Then he leaned back in his chair and said. Sometimes being right doesn't matter. I still remember those exact words. Because they told me everything. The investigation wasn't real. The meeting wasn't real. The outcome had been decided long before I walked into the room. I wasn't being fired because of a mistake. I was being fired because Rick wanted me gone. And suddenly, I started thinking about everyone who had gone through something similar. Greg. The employee who quit after months of being blamed for problems he didn't create. Kevin. The guy Rick publicly embarrassed over a mistake that barely mattered. Sarah. The employee who got humiliated in front of an entire department because a client sent one angry email. Tyler. The newest hire who somehow ended up with every impossible assignment in the company. For the first time, I started wondering if none of those situations had been accidents. Maybe I wasn't being fired because of a mistake. Maybe I was just the next person Rick had decided to get rid of. The HR representative handed me the termination paperwork. 3 years. Gone. Just like that. No warning. No performance improvement plan. No second chance. Nothing. I looked down at the papers. Then back at Rick. Part of me wanted to argue. Part of me wanted to fight. But honestly, I was exhausted. Months of Cedar Ridge. Months of pressure. Months of trying to earn approval from someone who had already decided what he thought of me. I signed the paperwork. The moment I did, Rick smiled. Then he gave me one final piece of advice. The kind of advice people give when they want to sound helpful. He said, "You're not cut out for this industry." I didn't respond. Then he added, "Maybe you'll have better luck somewhere else." The crazy thing is that I believed him. At least for a little while. Because when someone spends years tearing down your confidence, eventually part of you starts helping them. I gathered my things. Shook the HR representative's hand. And walked out. The entire meeting had lasted less than 10 minutes. 3 years reduced to 10 minutes. As I stepped into the hallway, I felt strangely numb. Not angry. Not sad. Just empty. Like my brain hadn't caught up yet. That feeling wouldn't last very long. The hardest part wasn't getting fired. It was walking back through the office afterward. Everyone knew. News traveled fast in that place. People pretended to work as I packed my desk. A few looked sympathetic. Most avoided eye contact. Nobody wanted to be associated with the person Rick had just removed. I don't blame them. I'd probably done the same thing a year earlier. Fear does strange things to people. As I packed the last box, Kevin walked over. He waited until nobody was looking. Then he handed me a folded piece of paper. I asked what it was. He told me not to open it until I got home. Then he walked away. That was it. No dramatic speech. No goodbye. Just a folded piece of paper. At the time, I didn't think much of it. I loaded everything into my car. Sat behind the steering wheel. And stared out the windshield. For the first time all day, I was completely alone. And without the noise of the office around me, the reality finally hit. I had no job. No plan. No idea what came next. Then I remembered the paper Kevin had given me. So I unfolded it. Inside were 4 handwritten words. 4 words that would change everything. Rick did this before. I stared at the note for almost a full minute. Just 4 words. Rick did this before. At first I wasn't even sure what it meant. Before what? Before me? Before Kevin? Before Greg? The more I thought about it, the more uncomfortable I became. Because deep down, I already knew the answer. I wasn't the first person Rick had targeted. I just didn't know how many others there had been. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept replaying the meeting. The projector screen. The accusations. The approval email. Rick's smile. And those 4 words. Rick did this before. The next morning I got a text from Kevin. Just a time and a location. Nothing else. Normally I would have ignored something that vague. Instead, I showed up 15 minutes early. The location turned out to be a small coffee shop on the other side of town. Kevin was already there. So was Greg. The moment I saw Greg sitting at the table, I knew this wasn't going to be a normal conversation. Greg looked older than I remembered. Not physically. Just tired. Like someone who had spent years carrying around a story nobody wanted to hear. I sat down. Nobody talked for a few seconds. Then Greg looked at me and asked. Did he blame Cedar Ridge on you? The fact that he knew the project name immediately made my stomach drop. I asked him how. Greg laughed. Not because it was funny. Because it wasn't. Then he said. Because he used the exact same playbook on me. For the next hour, Greg told me things I couldn't believe. And somehow, every single one of them was true. According to Greg, Rick had been doing the same thing for years. The details changed. The people changed. The projects changed. But the pattern never changed. First, Rick would find someone useful. Someone competent. Someone respected. Then he'd slowly increase their responsibilities. More work. More visibility. More pressure. At first it felt like trust. Then eventually something would go wrong. Maybe a mistake. Maybe a delay. Maybe something completely outside their control. It didn't matter. Rick would wait. Collect information. Build a story. Then when the timing was right, he'd make sure everyone believed the problem started and ended with that person. By the end, the employee usually felt grateful just to escape. I remember sitting there listening to Greg explain all of this and feeling sick. Because every step sounded familiar. Every detail matched what had happened to me. Then Greg said something I'll never forget. He said, "The mistake doesn't matter." I asked what he meant. He leaned forward. Then he said, "Rick chooses the person first. The mistake comes later." The entire table went quiet. Because all three of us knew he was right. For years we'd all thought we were being judged by our performance. In reality, performance had never been the point. Control was. And suddenly, for the first time since getting fired, I stopped feeling ashamed. I started feeling angry. The more Greg talked, the angrier I became. Not because I was learning anything new. Because I was realizing how much of it I'd ignored. Over the next few weeks, the three of us kept meeting. Me. Greg. Kevin. Sometimes we'd grab coffee. Sometimes we'd meet after work. The conversations always started the same way. Someone would remember another story. Another employee. Another incident. Another person Rick had pushed out. At first it sounded like coincidence. Then it started sounding like a pattern. Then it started sounding like a system. The craziest part was how many people had simply disappeared. Not literally. Professionally. Good employees. Experienced employees. People who should have built long careers there. Instead, one by one, they left. And every time they left, Rick somehow convinced everyone else they were the problem. One night Greg brought a notebook. Inside were names. Dates. Projects. Notes. At first I thought he was joking. He wasn't. For years, Greg had been keeping track. Not because he planned to expose Rick. Because writing it down helped him stay sane. As we flipped through the pages, I started seeing the same story over and over. A mistake. A public meeting. A damaged reputation. An exit. Different people. Same ending. And then I noticed something strange. Most of the people on Greg's list had one thing in common. They were good at their jobs. Really good. The kind of employees other companies would want. The kind of employees who didn't need Rick. And suddenly a thought crossed my mind. What if Rick wasn't removing weak employees? What if he was removing strong ones? Because strong employees are harder to control. A few months after I started my new job, the first rumors began. At first they sounded harmless. Small things. Project delays. Missed deadlines. Client complaints. Nothing unusual. Every company has problems. Then I got a phone call from Tyler. The same Tyler Rick had targeted after correcting him in a meeting. I hadn't spoken to him since getting fired. The moment I answered, he laughed. Not because anything was funny. Because he couldn't believe what was happening. Then he asked. "Have you heard about Cedar Ridge?" My stomach immediately tightened. According to Tyler, the project was a disaster. The client was furious. Schedules were falling apart. People were quitting. And somehow, Rick was still blaming everyone except himself. I remember sitting there smiling for the first time in months. Not because the company was struggling. Because I finally understood something. Rick needed other people to absorb the consequences of his mistakes. That was how he'd survived for so long. The problem was that he'd run out of people. Greg was gone. Kevin was looking for another job. Several project managers had already left. And I wasn't there anymore. For the first time, Rick was running out of shields. And the consequences were finally getting close enough to reach him. The next few months were strangely satisfying. Not because I was rooting for the company to fail. I wasn't. A lot of good people still worked there. People I liked. People who had done nothing wrong. But every week seemed to bring another story. Another problem. Another employee leaving. The first major shock came when Kevin resigned. Nobody expected it. Kevin had survived longer than almost anyone. If you'd asked me 6 months earlier who would outlast everyone else, I probably would have said Kevin. Then one Friday afternoon he walked into Rick's office. Closed the door. And handed in his resignation. According to Tyler, Rick completely lost his mind. He spent nearly an hour trying to convince Kevin to stay. The same Kevin he'd publicly humiliated. The same Kevin he'd blamed repeatedly. The same Kevin he'd treated as disposable. Suddenly Kevin was important. Suddenly Kevin mattered. Funny how that works. The best part? Kevin already had another job lined up. A better one. More money. Less stress. Actual leadership. When he told me that, I laughed harder than I should have. Because for years Rick acted like employees needed him. Now people were leaving and immediately finding better opportunities. The myth was starting to crack. And once people stop believing a myth, it usually collapses pretty quickly. About a month later, I got another call from Tyler. This time he sounded nervous. Not stressed. Nervous. Apparently Cedar Ridge had reached a breaking point. The client had started demanding answers. Schedules were slipping. Costs were rising. And for the first time, people outside the company were asking questions. Real questions. Questions Rick couldn't answer with a meeting or a scapegoat. One of the biggest problems involved documentation. Approvals. Project records. Communication logs. The exact kind of paperwork Rick never paid attention to until it became useful. And suddenly everyone was discovering something uncomfortable. A lot of decisions had Rick's name on them. A lot. Much more than anyone realized. For years he'd been able to shift blame because nobody bothered checking. Now people were checking. Every email. Every approval. Every change request. The more they looked, the worse things became. According to Tyler, the atmosphere in the office had completely changed. People weren't afraid anymore. They were angry. And angry employees asked questions. Questions Rick had spent years avoiding. For the first time, the spotlight wasn't on everyone else. It was on him. And Rick hated being the center of attention when he wasn't controlling the story. For a few days after that call with Tyler, I kept expecting another update. I don't know what I thought would happen. Maybe Rick would get fired. Maybe the client would pull the contract. Maybe the owner would finally realize what everyone else had known for years. But nothing obvious happened at first. That was the strange part. From the outside, Northridge looked the same. Same website. Same projects. Same people posting company updates online like everything was normal. But behind the scenes, something had shifted. I could feel it in the way Tyler talked about the office. Rick wasn't untouchable anymore. People weren't whispering around him. They were watching him. Waiting. And for someone like Rick, I think that was worse than being yelled at. Because yelling still gives you something to fight against. Silence gives you nothing. A few days later, Tyler sent me a text. It said, "He's been asking about you." I stared at the message for a while. Then I typed back, "Rick?" Tyler responded almost immediately. "Yeah. Keeps asking if anyone has talked to you." That was the first moment I realized Rick wasn't just in trouble. He was looking for a way out. And for some reason, that way out involved me. The first call came on a Tuesday afternoon. I remember because I was in the middle of a project review when my phone started vibrating. I glanced down. Rick. For a second, I honestly thought it was a mistake. We hadn't spoken in months. Not since the day he fired me. I stared at the screen until it stopped ringing. Then I flipped my phone over and went back to work. A few minutes later it rang again. Same number. Same caller. Rick. I ignored it. Again. Then he called a third time. That was when I knew something was wrong. The strange thing is that I didn't feel angry. Not anymore. Mostly I felt curious. Because people like Rick don't call former employees. Especially employees they publicly blamed and fired. People like Rick pretend those employees never existed. The calls continued throughout the week. Sometimes once. Sometimes 3 or 4 times. I never answered. Then one evening I got a voicemail. It was only 20 seconds long. And for the first time since I'd known him, Rick sounded nervous. Not stressed. Not frustrated. Nervous. He asked me to call him back. Said it was important. Said he needed to discuss an opportunity. Then he thanked me. Actually thanked me. I listened to the voicemail 3 times. Because hearing Rick say thank you felt like spotting a unicorn. Something had definitely changed. The question wasn't whether Rick needed something. The question was how desperate he'd become. I still didn't call him back. Honestly, I wasn't trying to make some grand statement. I just wasn't interested. For months, I'd been rebuilding my life. The last thing I wanted was another conversation with Rick. So I ignored the calls. The emails. The voicemails. All of it. Then one evening, Tyler called me. The moment I answered, he said, "I know why he's calling." I sat down immediately. For weeks, everyone had theories. Maybe Rick needed information. Maybe he wanted help. Maybe he was trying to protect himself. Tyler had an actual answer. According to him, ownership had finally reviewed the Cedar Ridge documentation. Not summaries. Not reports. The actual records. Every approval. Every change request. Every email. And the more they reviewed, the worse things looked. Apparently several major decisions had one thing in common. Rick's approval. Rick's signature. Rick's instructions. For years he'd survived by making sure responsibility flowed downhill. This time it didn't. This time there was paperwork. Actual proof. The kind of proof nobody could argue with. Then Tyler told me something that made everything click. Ownership wanted to speak with people who had worked on Cedar Ridge. Not just current employees. Former employees too. Employees like me. That was when I finally understood why Rick was calling. He wasn't trying to offer me a job. He wasn't trying to apologize. He wasn't trying to reconnect. Rick needed help. And for the first time in his career, he couldn't force anyone to give it to him. A few days later, I finally answered. Not because Rick convinced me. Because I was tired of wondering. The call came in while I was driving home from work. Same number. Same name. This time I picked up. For a second neither of us said anything. Then Rick spoke. And honestly, The silence told me more than his words ever could. For years, Rick always sounded confident. Even when he was wrong. Even when he was angry. Even when he was blaming someone else. Confidence was his default setting. This version sounded different. Smaller. He asked how I was doing. I almost laughed. The man who fired me wanted to know how I was doing. Then he asked about my new job. My family. My life. The conversation felt bizarre. Like we were both pretending the last 6 months had never happened. Eventually I got tired of it. So I asked the question. What do you want, Rick? The line went quiet. For a few seconds I thought he might hang up. Then he sighed. A real sigh. The kind people make when they're finally out of excuses. And for the first time since I'd known him, Rick told me the truth. He said. I need your help. I pulled into a parking lot and turned off the engine. Not because I was surprised. Because I wanted to hear exactly what came next. After everything that happened, hearing Rick ask for help felt impossible. Yet there he was. Asking anyway. Rick didn't explain much. That was the first thing I noticed. For someone who claimed the situation was urgent, he spent a lot of time avoiding details. Every answer felt carefully chosen. Every explanation felt incomplete. Whenever I asked what was actually happening, he'd give me some version of. It's complicated. Or. There's a lot going on. Or. I'd rather discuss it in person. The more he talked, the more obvious it became. Rick didn't want to explain the problem. He wanted to control the conversation. The same way he'd always controlled conversations. The same way he'd controlled meetings. The same way he'd controlled the story. The difference was that it wasn't working anymore. Not on me. Not after everything that happened. Finally I asked him directly. What exactly do you need from me? The line went quiet. For a few seconds I thought he might actually answer. Instead he said. I think it would be better if we met. That was when I knew Tyler had been right. Whatever was happening, it was bad. Bad enough that Rick didn't trust himself to discuss it over the phone. Bad enough that he wanted to look me in the eye. And for the first time since getting fired, I realized something. I wasn't the desperate one anymore. He was. Part of me wanted to hang up. Another part wanted to hear him squirm. In the end, curiosity won. I agreed to meet him. Not because I wanted to help. Because I wanted to see what desperation looked like on Rick. And something told me I was finally about to find out. The meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday. Rick chose a small coffee shop halfway between our offices. The kind of place business people use when they don't want conversations happening at work. I arrived 10 minutes early. Mostly because I wanted a good seat. Partly because I was curious. When Rick finally walked in, I almost didn't recognize him. Not because he looked older. Because he looked smaller. For years I'd only ever seen Rick in control. Confident. Certain. Commanding. This version looked tired. His suit was wrinkled. His eyes were bloodshot. And for the first time since I'd known him, he looked like someone carrying a problem he couldn't solve. He spotted me and walked over. Then something happened that shocked me. He apologized. Not a good apology. Not a complete apology. But still an apology. He said. I know things didn't end well. I almost laughed. Didn't end well. That was one way to describe it. For a few minutes we talked about meaningless things. Work. Traffic. Life. Both of us pretending we weren't there for a very specific reason. Eventually Rick stopped pretending. He leaned forward. Looked around the coffee shop. Then lowered his voice. And for the first time, I saw genuine fear in his eyes. That's when I knew the situation was even worse than Tyler thought. Rick told me the situation had gotten out of control. Not in those exact words. People like Rick rarely speak that directly. But that was the message. The client was asking questions. Ownership was asking questions. And according to Rick, everyone suddenly wanted documentation. Approvals. Timelines. Records. Proof. The same details he'd spent years ignoring. For a few minutes, I just listened. Honestly, it was fascinating. For the first time since I'd known him, Rick wasn't controlling the conversation. He wasn't directing blame. He wasn't criticizing someone else. He was explaining. Trying to justify. Trying to survive. Then he finally got to the point. He wanted me to help explain Cedar Ridge. Not because I had done anything wrong. Because I knew the project. I knew the timeline. I knew what actually happened. And more importantly, people trusted me. That last part hit me immediately. People trusted me. Not Rick. Me. The same person he'd publicly blamed. The same person he'd fired. The same person he said wasn't cut out for the industry. Now he needed my credibility. My reputation. My help. Then he made his biggest mistake. He started talking like helping him was the obvious thing to do. Like we were partners. Like none of the last 6 months had happened. And suddenly I realized something. Rick still didn't understand why he was in trouble. He thought his problem was documentation. Or ownership. Or clients. It wasn't. His problem was that he'd spent years burning every bridge around him. And now he needed to cross one. For a few seconds, neither of us said anything. Rick had finally asked for what he wanted. Now he was waiting for an answer. The strange thing is that I wasn't angry. Not anymore. 6 months earlier, I probably would have enjoyed watching him squirm. But sitting across from him, I mostly felt disappointed. Because after everything that happened, he still didn't get it. He thought the problem was Cedar Ridge. He thought the problem was documentation. He thought the problem was ownership. The problem was trust. And trust was the one thing he didn't have anymore. I asked him a simple question. One question. Do you think you treated me fairly? The look on his face was immediate. He wasn't expecting that. For the first time during the entire meeting, he didn't have an answer ready. He looked down at his coffee. Then back at me. Then away again. Eventually he said. Some mistakes were made. I almost laughed. Some mistakes were made. That was as close to accountability as Rick could get. Not. I blamed you. Not. I was wrong. Not. I'm sorry. Just. Some mistakes were made. In that moment, I knew everything I needed to know. Because if he couldn't be honest now, he never would be. And suddenly my decision became very easy. I told Rick no. Not dramatically. Not angrily. Just no. I wasn't interested in helping him explain Cedar Ridge. I wasn't interested in defending decisions I didn't make. And I definitely wasn't interested in protecting someone who spent years refusing to protect anyone else. For a moment, Rick looked genuinely shocked. Like the possibility had never occurred to him. Then he started negotiating. More meetings. Consulting work. Money. Anything. The funny thing is that 6 months earlier, I would have done almost anything to earn his approval. Now I didn't want any part of it. Eventually the conversation ended. Rick paid for the coffee. We shook hands. And I walked away. That was the last time I ever saw him. A few months later, Tyler called with one final update. Rick was gone. Not arrested. Not sued. Not some dramatic ending. Just gone. Ownership had finally lost confidence in him. The same phrase he'd used when he fired me. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The company survived. Clients stayed. Projects continued. The world moved on. And for the first time in years, people inside that office could breathe. Sometimes people ask if I regret not helping him. Honestly? No. Not because I wanted revenge. Because consequences matter. For years, Rick made other people carry the consequences of his decisions. Eventually, he had to carry his own. And that's really the whole story. The day Rick fired me, he told me I'd never make it in this industry. 6 months later, he called begging for help. The funny thing is that he was right about one thing. I wasn't cut out for that industry. I was cut out for something better.